right, hello everyone. It is just about noon Eastern time, so we will go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Ryan Hannafin. I'm with the marketing team at Hawks Learning. Thank you for joining us for the Learning and Growing 2021 presentation, Taking Advantage of COVID to Teach Economics. Our presenter today is Professor Hamideh Shokoohian from Yorkville University. Professor Shokoohian is a full-time lecturer at Yorkville University. She has an MA in economics from Simon Fraser University and has been teaching economics and statistic courses in several institutions in Canada. Apart from teaching, Professor Shokoohian is also active in course development, book review, and coaching new instructors. We will have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen there. So if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, feel free to put those in there and I will help moderate those as we go along. On that note, I will hand it over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. So thank you everyone for being here today and coming to my presentation. And I also want to thank Hawks Learning for the great opportunity. I've been attending these webinars a lot, and at least for me, I realized that they have been quite useful. So I think I can now go ahead and start sharing my screen, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, yep. And okay, so what I'm gonna talk about today is about taking advantage of COVID to teach economics. So as Ryan mentioned, I've been teaching economics courses at Yorkville University, Canada. And now it's been more than 4 years that I've been teaching economics courses. And apart from economics courses, I also teach statistics, finance, and so some other courses in business. So what I'm gonna do through the presentation today is that, first of all, I am going to give you a brief motivation behind this presentation. And then after that, I'm gonna discuss the question that I'm trying to answer during this presentation. And then after that, I will discuss the adjustment and that the methods that I have been using to adjust my assessment and my teaching methods during pandemic. And so to address the question related to how I adjust my teaching methods to address the implication of COVID on my teaching, I am going to talk about building thinking classrooms as an approach that I have been using. And after that, we will have Q&A at the end, but while I am going through the presentation, feel free to ask your questions. Stop me if you have any questions, and Ryan will help me to get your question. So as I mentioned, I've been teaching economics courses now for about 4 years, and I'm sure that most of you here, you may be teaching economics probably more than what I have taught. But what I always do in my classes, especially during the first class, is that I give a small talk to my students, and I tell them that to treat economics courses different from other courses that they take. Don't think of economics as a course that they just need to take, get a good grade, and then pass the course. I always tell them that economics is a course that they can, if they use it wisely, they can use it. It's an opportunity for them that they can use it's a golden opportunity for them that they can use to actually become smarter citizens, who have a knowledge to be involved in an intellectual conversation about government policies, about economic news, which is very appealing for most students. But what I realized is that before pandemic, this small talk, it didn't intrigue drastical response from students, meaning that most of the questions that I received after during the first class, especially after my talk, was related to the assessment methods. What's, for example, asking about what are the grading criteria, what is the textbook, are we going to have a midterm exam, final exam, a group project. So questions were typical kind of questions that we normally get. But then what I realized is that through pandemic, I realized that students show huge excitement in the very first class. So the type of question that I receive from my students in the very first class after I give them the small talk is totally different from the questions that I get in the past. So, for example, they ask about, are we going to talk about future inflation? Are we going to talk about government debt in the course? So they are the question that they ask in the class, in the very first class, show me that they are the students' perspective and interest about learning economics has changed because of pandemic. So to give you a little background here, the sample of students that I'm talking about, that I've been teaching economics courses, and just the macroeconomics I'm talking about, it's around 16 sections, and in each section I had minimum 20 students during pandemic. This is the sample size that I had. I believe it's big enough for me to get this conclusion, but unfortunately it's not diverse enough. So for that, I'm gonna ask your input, your insight about this. I want you to tell me if you also feel the same, if we are in the same page, if you also see an increase in the students' excitement and interest in economics courses. So I believe Ryan is gonna conduct a poll here.
All right. Poll should now be available to everybody. All right. It looks like we are at about 86% for yes and 14% for no.
So that's good enough for me to assume that my conclusion is correct, and this is something that is a trend that we see it in different areas. So thank you so much for participating in the poll. So, and now if you accept this, if you accept that COVID has impacted the students' interest and excitement about the the economics courses. So there is a huge line of research that tells us that we need to take advantage of this situation. We need to turn this situation to a golden situation to facilitate the students' learning, because we all know most of the times the main difficulties that we have is related. It's the problem that the students are not interested enough in the course and in the subject. So if we already have that, so then we already are really ahead of our goal here. So now the question becomes, how can we take advantage of this situation, and how we can take advantage to promote students' interest, and how we can respond to this change that we see it's happening during COVID. So what I'm going to share with you is based on my experience, is what I've been using in my courses. And I'm gonna share with you how I change my teaching methods and my assessment methods to respond to this situation. And at least for me, and the approach that I'm gonna share with you, they worked really well for me. So I hope that you also found them useful. So before I start talking about the how I changed my teaching methods and then the assessment methods, I'm going to talk about the importance of the first class on promoting students' interest. So if I believe in each class that we have a group of students who hates economics. We have a group of students who are indifferent. We have a group of students who like economics. So then within the last group, those who are interested in economics, I believe there are students who wouldn't be interested in economics in a world without COVID. So then if we pay attention to this point, it becomes very crucial and very important for us to make sure that we are spending a good amount of time on developing our lesson plan or changing and adjusting our lesson plan based on COVID. So if we don't do that, then we are, with a high chance, we are killing the interest of those students who became interested just because of COVID. And also we are killing the opportunity of evoking interest in those students who either hate economics or they are indifferent. So then we should change our lesson plan to implement in a way that at least, especially in the first class, we need to make sure that we design a very thoughtful small talk. That we for sure talk about the implications of COVID, that we show them that they are gonna learn about these concepts through the course. And something that I found very helpful for me is that during the first class, I show them a list of practical questions that they will see and explore in the course. So we always have this list for ourselves, but I just added a COVID flavor to the list of our question. I tell them that we are gonna see that, for example, how does the COVID impact the economy? And for example, how the current situation is different from what we had back in 2007. What is the state, how the government or the central bank are responding to COVID. So we are going to talk about government debt. We are going to talk about how government finances its debt. We are going to talk about how what's the impact of this government debt probably on the future inflation. So these are the questions that just either promote interest in those students who became interested in economics because of COVID, or it will evoke interest in those who are either hate economics or they are indifferent. So now the rest of my presentation is more about sharing some practical example that how I have changed my teaching methods. So what I try to do during COVID is that I try to do my best to implement the building thinking classrooms in my class. So for those of you who are not familiar with this approach, this is a great work, an amazing work that that's done by the Professor Peter Liljedahl, and he's a professor of Department of Education at SFU. And so this approach is the result of more than 10 years work, and the work involved more than 400 instructors. So the idea is to develop a class in a way. It's a set of tools, a set of suggestions and practices that help both students and instructors to create a notion of thinking in the class, to make thinking as a main component of the class. So I'm not going to talk about the details of this approach, but I'm gonna just touch upon some main ideas behind that are related to my talk. So, based on this building thinking classrooms, so there are 11 elements that or 11 tools that that instructors and students could make sure that they pay attention in order to follow, to have a thinking classroom. So the idea is that the class will start with instructor giving a very simple problem, a problem that is engaging enough and it's simple enough that the students will contribute, will participate. So, and then the instructor will assign students in a random group. That is very important, that the group to be random, and then give them some space that is just for a group. It's, for example, when we were back in campus, that space was a piece of a big paper, or for example, a part of, if we were talking about a big classroom, could be window, could be any a small part of the whiteboard. And then instructor gives oral instruction to different groups, circulating around the groups, and give them oral instruction. It's very important. Instructor just give oral instruction as opposed to any written instructions. And then the instructor will address and help students from different direction of the room, sometimes from, let's say, one group, and so it's very unfortunately, this item we cannot have in our Zoom classes. We cannot define the room. But then the next implement and the next step is that instructor will answer questions in different groups, only those answers who continue thinking process. So then it becomes very important for instructor to practice. It takes lots and lots of practice for instructors to make sure that they can anticipate the questions that they get from students, and know that which questions probably will stop thinking, and then know how to respond to those questions. And then somehow instructor build an autonomy in the class. So students see that a class is a space that thinking is an expectation for them. They are expected to think and participate. So, and then instructor will give to just continue the flow. Instructor will give some hints and extensions and make sure that all of the groups, they have a minimum understanding about the lecture, about the concept, and about the problem, and then ask students to take notes for themselves. And at the end, give them assessments, that give them questions that they work in a group and then submit individually. So then if I want to tell you, if I want to just describe this whole approach in a very, very simple explanation, the approach is that to minimize instructor role in the class, as opposed to giving the lecture, into someone who is facilitating discussion and create a thinking environment that students will discover the lecture, will discover the objectives of the course of that session. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna give you example of how I am using this approach, or at least try to use this approach, because some of the components and elements, at least to best of my understanding, we cannot implement them in the Zoom and online classes. So I'm gonna show you how I'm using this approach in one of the concepts that I teach in macroeconomics, which is monetary policy. So I'm gonna assume that everyone here is teaching economics or has the background of economics. So what I do at the session that I'm teaching monetary policy, when I start the class by asking the question that I have in the slide. I ask them, why did Bank of, so sorry, my presentation, I should mention also that as well, that my presentation is in the Canadian context. So some of you may, it may, you should just adopt this to any other context that fits for your class. So the question that I asked them is that, why did Bank of Canada reduce the policy rate? So this is the question that it's simple enough. I mean, because now the economics news is all over the place. Almost all students, they heard about this news, so they know that something could be wrong, they have something to share. It's engaging enough and it's somehow at least students, they think that it's simple enough that they could participate with a minimal, let's say just one sentence. So, and then after giving them the question, what I do is that, so here I need to stop sharing my screen and go to, I need to share my browser. Okay. So what I do is that I ask them to use their cell phone. So that's another advantage, and that's an advantage. So I'm trying to get students use their cell phone, which traditionally was a source of distraction for them, and turns that into a learning tool. So I asked them to pick their phone, and I asked them to open their Google and then just search for the website of Bank of Canada. So what I do is that I make sure that all of them are following this, all of them are on the same page with me, and then I just give them minimal instruction. So here, just for the sake of this presentation, I'm gonna show what the students see and what they are supposed to do. So they open the website of the Bank of Canada. Could be Fed's website, could be any other website that you think fits for that session or that concept. So then I ask them in this on the top of the I give them the direction to open the explainers of the website, and then I ask them to open the document related to output gap. So I asked them to open the document related to output gap. I should say that my students, before having the lecture on monetary policy, they are familiar with the concept of output gap. So this part is somehow something for them to remember and to remember from the previous sessions. So then I give them a one sentence of definition for the output gap, and then letting them know that what does the negative and positive output gap show, and then I ask them to read this part. That the output gap is an important variable for monetary policy, as it is a key source of inflation pressure in the economy. So this is not me reading this for them. They by themselves, I just give them the direction where to read. So this is the part that they are supposed to read. And then they will continue reading this paragraph in which it explains that the idea behind negative and positive output gaps. So they remember that the details about output gaps. And so after this, what I do is that I ask them to take notes, one sentence here, writing down this one, that this very first sentence of this part, that the output gap is an important variable for monetary policy. This is point number one for them to have in their notes. And then I ask them, here I give them the instruction. I remind them about the inflation targeting that the Bank of Canada has, and I tell them that as they already knew that the central bank has a specific target for the rate of inflation. And then I open this understanding inflation targeting for them, and then ask them to just read this one sentence here on the top. So as I mentioned, the inflation targeting and also the output gap is the concept that they are just reviewing. It's nothing new for them. So by opening these documents, I am helping them to remember, to review what they already knew about the concept, because they already, when I taught them the output gaps, or when I taught them the inflation targeting for that central bank has, I opened this in these documents and I showed them these points. So then for point number 2, I tell them to take a note, writing down point number 2, that at the Bank of Canada, we aim to keep inflation close to 2%. And then I will give them again I remind them that central bank is flexible about the rate of inflation within the 1 to 3%. So, and then I stop here and I ask them, what do they think about the current output gap, about the sign of the current output gap in the economy of Canada? So most of the time I get the right answer. And then after that part, so far I haven't done anything. I haven't give them any lecture, any specific guidelines from me. These are just students involving and engaging in their own learning. So then I ask them to open through statistics, I ask them to open indicators and check the data about output gap. So, and then they see that what they expected, it's true. And they can see data. So why it's important? Because they feel related. They feel that they are connected to this concept, because this is something that's happening right now. They are in the middle of a live policy that is imposed by the central bank, and they can see it every day around them. So then when they see these numbers, I ask them to add this note on their notebook and write down the sign of the output gap that they see in the data. And then I ask them, now, what do you expect about the rate of inflation? So because they already read something in the output gap document that told them that whenever there is negative output gap, there is probably the inflation rate goes beyond 2%. So they should discover that by themselves without checking data. So then, now, assuming that they get this right, I'm gonna show them the data for inflation. And then again, they see, yes, they got this correctly. The inflation is now below the target that central bank has. So then now I ask them this question that, okay, now, do we have enough signal in the economy that tells us that central bank needs to do something, needs to impose a policy? So based on the reading that they had, at the beginning, the output gap and the inflation, the part that I guided them to read in the inflation targeting and then output gap, they should know, they have their answer that yes, central bank now, based on the signals that we see, should impose a policy. And then I ask them to write this conclusion on their notebook. After that, I will open the interest rate statistics for interest rate, and I open the policy interest rates here. Oops, sorry. Before this, I show them the explainers for for understanding policy interest rate. So I tell them this part is it's the last, it's for my students is the concept that they learn week before the monetary policy. They learn how what are the tools that central bank use to impose, to change supply of money. So they're familiar with policy interest rate. I open the document and I ask them, okay, now go ahead, read this one important sentence on the top, which tells them that the importance of this policy interest rate for imposing monetary policy. So now they are connecting the dots. They know that central bank needs to impose a policy. That's the time we have enough signal now. And they also know another dot is that they also know that central bank has policy interest rate as the main tool to impose this policy. So then here to engage them to promote their interest, what I do is that I I tell them to read this paragraph, what it all means for you. What does this policy interest rate mean for you, your family? So it's one important sentence here that tells them that the policy interest rate that they are about to learn more is related to the mortgage rate that their families pay. So they become more engaged. We are gonna learn something cool. We are gonna know that something that we have answered for our parents when asking us, what do you think how do you think this our mortgage rate will change? We have something to intellectually to say. So now after this, I will open the interest rates here, and I open the policy interest rate and show them this data. So, and to make it clear, this is not me showing all of this. I just guide them to open all of this part in their phone and have all of this check out by themselves. I just give them the minimal instruction. I just make sure that those students who have troubles opening website or something like that, I can help those students. Minimum guidelines from me. Just in case I will intervene, just in case it needed. So now that they see this, I ask them to write down, to add another sentence into their notebook so the policy interest rate has decreased substantially during pandemic. So far they have the a sentence about output gap, a sentence about inflation targeting, a sentence about the sign-up output gap, and a sentence about the importance of the policy interest rate for monetary policy, and a sentence about the direction that this policy interest rate has changed. And now I ask them to take their time, read through their notebooks, and give me, write down for me 2 or 3 sentences explaining or summarizing what they learned so far, what they see, what are the dots that they are connecting here. So then after that, I will get back to the rest of the data and then continue the process as I showed towards the beginning. So I'm not going to continue with this example because I have some other concepts to cover and I don't want to bore you with this example. So I hope that I made my point and showed you how I implementing this building thinking classrooms in my class to engage students in the concept. So then we can use for some helpful website that we can use to take to implement this approach is that obviously the website of the central bank, they have so many interactive tools that we can use. For example, inflation calculator, investment calculator that they can use, or we can use Fred, or we can use the interactive data, interactive tools of in BA. These are all very, very handy and useful interactive tools that we can use in our class. So then advantage of this approach, obviously, so as you probably realize, is that it triggers the students' critical thinking, their critical reading, and also as well as critical listening. So, and also students, they use their cell phone as a tool for learning, as opposed to a source of distraction, which again, I believe it's very helpful for them. So then now coming to the point at how I should be a little, I think I'm running over time. Ryan, can I continue?
Yeah, I'd say I think we were originally slotted for about 30 minutes, but I think if we go for like another 5 or so, that shouldn't be a problem at all.
Okay, thank you so much. So then how I'm changing and adjusting my assessment methods is that I try to create assignments using real data, so I don't have time to go and open that for you. So I open the BA interactive tool and data tool, and then I open the data for different parts of the GDP consumption, investment, and then they see in the real time that they, for example, this month's consumption dropped. So then the questions are related to, for example, why do you think during that month the consumption decreased, or why, for example, investment changed, or why, for example, the consumption during pandemic, during COVID, has sorry, I, for example, ask them to go check data and see how they can compare the current economic situation with the economic crisis back in 2007 in terms of data, how different components of GDP affected differently in these two during this the COVID pandemic and as well as the recession. And then I also use the central bank speeches to conduct give them assignment. And also another thing that helps me a lot is that I try to relate the assessment to their daily activities. For example, asking them to watch The Big Short and then compare recession of 2007 with the current situation. Or, for example, watch this part of, for example, Friends, which I realize that they love, and then tell me, for example, how that one is related to this concept. Or sometimes I play a part of those parts in the class. Okay, so I am so sorry. I think I wasn't mindful of time. So thank you
That's
so
fine.
much.
No worries at all. That was a great presentation. Did anyone have any questions? If you do, feel free to put those into the Q&A session, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and I'd be happy to unmute you as well. And while we wait, I just had a quick question out of curiosity. Just considering the pandemic's impact on the economy over the last year and everything, I was just curious if you had students approaching you in real time about specific policies, and if that did happen, did you have to, how did that affect your lesson plan in order to kind of maintain their interest?
So yes, that actually happened. And the interesting point about this, about COVID, is that it's unbelievable. But I have this story that once I was showing the data for my students, and I had two classes, one in so one in Monday, if I'm not mistaken, another one the next day, Tuesday. So I was showing them the data, and so I was discussing that how the inflation decreased, and now we are in the face of deflation. And then the next day, when I was checking the data, the central bank, they updated the data, and then we didn't have deflation anymore. It was a positive inflation rate. So I was giving them the somehow the speech to prepare them to get this idea that we are right now in a situation of deflation. And then suddenly I opened the website and I realized, wow, no, that's not anymore the case. So and then I told them this story that yesterday the situation was different, and then I realized that how it engaged them more, like how it intrigues their engagement. So, and in terms of, and coming back to your question, Ryan, what whenever I get questions like this, I try to mention that question in the, if I get that question during my office hours, or if it's the email that I receive the question, I make sure that I will get back to the question during class, mentioning that the question during class, that your classmate, for example, had this question. And then I see that when they see that there is engagement coming from their classmates, there is interest coming from their classmates, they become more engaged. It's like a loop.
Great. Very nice. And it looks like we do have somebody with their hand raised. So Henku, I'm going to unmute you real quick.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about, do you apply this method to asynchronous or synchronous or both? Like, it could be different approach. It should be different approach maybe in asynchronous versus synchronous. So I'm just wondering how you using different format of online class.
So I used, thank you so much for your question. Very good question, Yoon. So I used this approach back when we were on campus, face-to-face classes. But then starting pandemic, I've been teaching only online Zoom classes. So, and which is 3 hours of online classes. And what I'm doing is that I'm trying to, this approach primarily is implemented for face-to-face classes, not for online classes. And so there are some parts and some steps in the in the approach that we cannot, at least to best of my understanding, we cannot have in Zoom classes. Or for example, like we cannot send the students to breakout room that frequently as to give them questions to work in group. So I just tried, what I did is that I am trying to adjust this approach to best way that it fits my classes. So for example, the approach by itself says that we should have students working in a group, having a specific space for themselves, standing around the class. It's very important for students to not sit down in the class, but standing. It's very important. And then, so we don't have that. But what I do is that I just give them the question. So I just keep the notion of giving them question and then send them to breakout room to discuss the main part, to discuss, for example, after giving them, let's say, 2 or 3 dots, or two or three small questions, I send them to breakout room to make sure that they can discuss with their group mates, with their classmates, and they don't feel overwhelmed that they are receiving so many information that they cannot process. But as I said, it's not a perfect way of implementing this approach. But as I said, this approach is just designed for face-to-face classes. I hope that I answered your question.
Great. Did we have any other questions? All right. Well, I think that's just about all the time we have. Thank you so much, Professor Shokoohian. We really appreciate it. And thank you all the attendees for joining as well. If anyone has any questions, you can direct them to marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we'll make sure that it gets over to Professor Shokoohian. And we will be emailing everybody a link that will actually have a recording of this as well, so you can go back and reference it as you need. We'll get that to you all in the coming days. But unless anybody has any other questions, y'all have a fantastic day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
You too.